Okay, so we left off with this graphic here in our first half of our lecture, and I think that this graphic really helps us understand what positive psychology is ultimately striving for, and that is to be holistic, to look at an entire spectrum of human behavior. So by no means is positive psychology saying that pathology or illness or neurosis are not important, or that the question what is wrong with you is not something that we shouldn't focus on. But that the types of strategies that you need to go from a -10 to a 0, which would be going from suffering to functioning, from a -10 to a 0, that those types of strategies are not going to be the types of strategies that are going to ultimately move you from functioning to flourishing, from a 0 to a +10. So once you're in a state where nothing is necessarily wrong with you, how do you move to a place where you're experiencing a lot of meaning, a lot of purpose, a lot of engagement in your life and in your work, a lot of life satisfaction? And that what positive psychology ultimately says is that you really want to focus on trying to think about two questions. What's wrong with you, so you can ultimately correct your weaknesses, but what's right with you? What are your strengths? What are your virtues? What are your gifts? And how do you nurture those in such a way so that you actually feel the most pleasure, the most meaning, the most purpose, the most satisfaction ultimately in your life? And so positive psychology would really say that focusing on the positive or the negative side, focusing on one or the other, is a really incomplete way to think about humanity. That focusing only on the good or the bad is not the way that we should develop an empirical science to sort of understand what are the most important types of preventative programs that we can develop. And so that's really, I think, part of what positive psychology is. So often when I'm talking about positive psychology, people will ask me, what about negative psychology? And again, it's not so much that these questions are inappropriate, or that positive psychology only wants to focus on one side of the distribution. It's really a more holistic view. And as a matter of fact, the founder, Marty Seligman, has really extensively written on the benefits of focusing on pathology. He shows in a review paper in 1994 that at least 14 disorders that were not curable, that provided much difficulty in people's lives, as of almost now 20 years ago, are curable, or at least can be considerably relieved, and so that a person can feel like they have a life that is at least functioning. So there's been huge strides in the understanding of therapy for mental illness, and this has provided huge benefits in people's lives. And so this is really, I think, ultimately what positive psychology has been advocating for, really a balancing of both what is wrong with people, or the study of deficits, with what is right with people, or the study of their assets, or the study of their strengths, the study of their virtues, or the study of what they do well. And any science that focuses only on one of these two questions is ultimately just an incomplete science. So two things that we've talked about so far in the first lecture. Misnomer number one is that positive psychology wasn't just invented in 1999. It has its roots in really some of the most historically important studies of the turn of the 20th century in humanistic philosophy, and is really just an extension of psychology's original mission, as well as sort of the theories of the humanist. Number two, I think it's really important that the types of activities that we would engage in to move a person from illness to no illness are not going to be the types of activities that we're going to use to move them from no illness to optimal health. So think about if you actually had an illness and the types of treatments that you would undergo to eliminate that illness. continuing those treatments won't necessarily return you to what you would consider sort of your best health. And this is, again, because there has been this sort of pathological bias, right? Because there's been a focus really on sort of the negative side throughout psychology's more recent history, from the end of World War II to the really the turn of the 21st century. We know a great deal more about negative emotions and illness than we do about positive emotions and health, and that's really the balance that positive psychology is striving for, is to have an equally an equal amount of information about what are the roles and the functions and the evolutionary reasons that negative emotions have evolved, which again often lead to a lot of our physical illnesses, but also to know just as much about why is it that we experience awe and ecstasy and joy, and that many of those types of positive emotions are actually linked to some of the most important health outcomes that we actually have. All right, I'm going to discuss this here, give you about 10 seconds to do the activity. During that little break, I want you to pause so that you actually take part in the activity. But I really want you to think about 3 different things, or 3 different types of days, and the things that you would do on those days to experience either pleasure or flow or meaning. So pleasure is really pleasure versus pain. Really what you think of as sort of just hedonism. So what would you do to have sort of this hedonistic day? A good day would be marked by flow, which would be really like absorption into a certain type of task. A day in which time sort of goes by really, really quickly. And a meaningful or purposeful day. So stop the lecture here for a bit. Write down different types of activities. You can mark them into 3 different columns. What would be a pleasurable day, what would be a good day, and what would be a meaningful day. And of course there might be some activities that overlap there, but try and think of the ones that would specifically lead to only one of these types of days. Okay, hopefully you actually did that activity. Now what I want you to do is actually think about how are those activities really different from each other. And this is part of really the goal of positive psychology, is to think about what does it mean to experience pleasure and flow and meaning, and how different types of activities can lead to those. And that's really what one of the major goals of positive psychology is, to provide this sort of vision or this sort of prescription, so that we can know what types of actions or activities lead to well-being, to positive individuals, and really ultimately to positive, thriving communities. And so positive psychology, much like clinical psychology, can't escape its prescriptive nature. That part of the desire is to sort of outline for people what is a good life, what does it mean to have a good life, even though there would be large variation in people's responses to what the good life actually is. And ultimately, we want to be able to sort of document what kinds of families would have children that would flourish, what kind of work settings would provide the most satisfaction for their workers, what kind of policies would lead to people having the most civic engagement, and really ultimately the most, the life that you want to lead the most. You could sort of say that one of the ultimate goals is, can we sort of draw people into these types of questions? Can we sort of help provide parents and families with a way of thinking about how they could parent and live in a way that would ultimately allow them to flourish? So we're not going to talk too much about the last few slides here. Just a quick note to say that positive psychology is, we're going to see, really expanded out. Thinks of well-being very holistically. You can see that we think of well-being not just sort of in present hedonism, but it's sort of our evaluation of our past and our contentment and satisfaction, our present, the flow, and sort of happiness. But we also have this sort of hope and this optimism towards the future that will ultimately have a life that's worth living. So these are the 3 major types of questions that we want to ask in positive psychology. Really, what makes one moment better than another? What distinguishes happy people from unhappy people? And as we'll see sort of towards the end of the class, what helps create positive communities and positive institutions? So there's really good reasons to study positive psychology, and I'm glad that we're on this journey together.